Hello, BookTube. I have a lovely poem to read to you today, and it comes from a new anthology, a new entry in our small lineup of anthologies for these daily poetry readings. This is the Oxford Book of English Verse, the revised and updated edition, which I just found yesterday. I found it in the dust jacket was in rough shape, so I reinforced. I'm not going to get rid of this thing, and it also had a boring cover. It was just the name. It was this name on the cover, so I put a nice English countryside scene on there to make the cover. And I found a poem in here that it did not make the cut for the revised Oxford Book of English Verse, edited by Helen Gardner. But before I read that, I wanted to read you Arthur Quiller Couch's addition to this, his preface to this new edition, which is delightful. So I want to just take a minute. I want to read you that before we get to our poem. By favor of the public, the Oxford Book of English Verse has held its own in request for close upon 40 years. The editor would stand convicted of dullness indeed, if in these years he had not learnt, revising his judgment, to regret some inclusions and omissions of indolence, the industry of scholars having rescued to light meanwhile many gems long hidden away in libraries, miscellanies, even scrapbooks. In this new edition, therefore, I have risked repairing the old structure with a stone here, a tile there, and hope to have left it as weatherproof as when it was first built. I have added 100-odd pages, and close upon Armistice Day 1918, admitting a few later numbers by poets who, whether consciously or not, had indicated before that date the trend of their genius. I shrank, of course, from making the book unwieldy, but in fact also I felt my judgment insecure amid post-war poetry. Although I cannot dispute against time, this is not to admit a charge of crabbed age. Since it has been my good fortune to spend the most part of these later years with the young, and to share, even in some measure to encourage, their zest for experiment. The Muses' house has many mansions. Their hospitality has outlived many policies of state, more than a few religions, countless heresies. Tamen usque recurrent Apollo gets in a little Horace quote there. And it were profane to misdoubt the nine as having forsaken these long-favored islands. Of experiment I still hold myself fairly competent to judge. But writing in 1939, I am at a loss what to do with the fashion of morose disparagement, of sneering at things long by Catholic, that's with a small c, Catholic consent accounted beautiful, of scorning at man's unconquerable mind and hanging up, without benefit of laundry, our common humanity as a rag on a clothesline. Be it allowed that these present times are dark. Yet what are our poets of use? What are they for, if they cannot hearten the crew with auspices of daylight? I tell you, Edwardian prose. There's just nothing like it. It was written in 1939, but it was forged in the Edwardian era. In time no less perilous, Wordsworth could write, "In our halls is hung armory of the invincible knights of old." Armory, not museum pieces, still less tear bottles. In the reader, turning the pages of this book, will find this note of valiancy, of the old Roman virtue mated with cheerfulness, dominant throughout, if in many curious moods. He may trace it back, if he care, far behind Chaucer, to the rudest beginnings of English song. It is indigenous, proper to our native spirit, and it will endure. I have to notice the pathos there, right, of writing that in 1939 in England. You have to notice the pathos of defiantly sounding that note that there are qualities in English verse, in English life, that will endure. They are great, they have endured a lot, and they will continue. Despite, the thing that he's nagging at here is the disparagement of his too cynical current age in England. But you have to think in the back of his mind, he was also thinking about dark clouds gathering everywhere. But that was the preface. Very heartening to know that back in 1939, even such a crusty old pedantosaurus as Arthur Quiller Couch could note quite accurately that the thing that stops his brain from ossifying is continued association with the young. But the poem that we're going to read, also by a young man, and it's born in tragedy, but the poem is not tragic. The poem is by Hartley Coleridge, who was the son of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and took to poetry. He did other things as well. He did some editing and whatnot, but he was also a published poet. That's a merciless thing. That's an absolutely merciless thing. when you decide to become a published poet, when you share the surname and are known to be the son of one of the greatest poets in the English language, that's rough. And the chances that the son will have the same level of talent, if not the same kind of talent, as his father, are virtually nil. And Hartley Coleridge didn't, and I think he knew it. I think he knew it. I think it was pointed out to him many times by rude people. We would never, you should never point that out. But it's the worst thing in the world to walk up to somebody, the son of a famous novelist or the son of a famous poet in this case, and say, well, you're not as talented as your father was. A, they're probably going to agree with you, and B, it's just going to make them feel bad. There's nothing anybody can do about it. And the tragedy part isn't that. I mean, that's I mean, where do I sit to tell Hartley, the ghost of Hartley Coleridge, that when you were 20 you should have gone into some other profession? It's you go where you want, right? And you go where your spirit leads you. But nevertheless, if you were to read the collected poems of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and then the collected poems of Hartley Coleridge, is there a collected poetry of Hartley Coleridge that is currently in print in a popular press edition? I don't know of one. I don't know that there's been one in a long, long time. But if you read them side by side, you don't need to know anything about poetry to know right away that some unbelievable fire is animating the work of the father, and that it is all but absent in the work of the son, who has nevertheless mastered the technical aspect of poetry perfectly well. So his poems are quite pleasant to read. He was a tragic figure, too, and it wasn't that. It wasn't just that he was toiling in the same profession as his father, only without his father's talent, the extent of his father's talent. It was also just personally. He was introduced to serious overindulgence in alcohol when he was still in his late teens, and it took hold, and there was no one to uproot it. There was no one to get rid of that hold. So it stayed with him for his whole life. He couldn't shake it off himself, and no one could help him shake it off. So he was a drunk, basically, for his whole life. He wasn't always, falling down inebriated or anything like that. He didn't get quite so bad as, for instance, Kingsley Amis. But he couldn't live without it for more than an hour, for more than an afternoon. I myself argue that he was saved from the embarrassment of that showing in his work because his work depends so much on those raw mechanicals of verse making. But the poem that I want to read you is pretty good. It's called Friendship, and it goes like this. When we were idlers with the loitering rills, the need of human love we little noted. Our love was nature, and the peace that floated on the white mist and dwelt upon the hills, to sweet accord subdued our wayward wills. One soul was ours, one mind, one heart devoted, that, wisely doting, asked not why it doted, and ours the unknown joy which knowing kills. But now I find how dear thou wert to me, that man is more than half of nature's treasure, of that fair beauty which no eye can see, of that sweet music which no ear can measure. And now the streams may sing for others' pleasure, the hills sleep on in their eternity. A neat little thing, and a neat sentiment that I myself have felt enormously. I haven't felt it towards, a human the way I think this poem is. This poem is definitely aimed at a sweet and innocent love known in nature between the narrator of the poem and another human. I've known it that kind of what was the great phrase? One heart devoted, that wisely doting asked not why it doted. That kind of uninterrogated love that is directly linked with nature, that is directly happens in nature. I experienced that growing up. I know exactly what that feels like to have that kind of connection without ever any enunciation of that connection. So it's neat that once again, I always talk about on these daily poetry readings that it's always neat when a poet captures something evanescent like that, something that is real, but that maybe that never before has been put in such lovely words, such durable words. I don't know how durable. Like I mentioned, I'm not 100% sure how durable Hartley Coleridge is. I'm not sure how much he's anthologized. I'm not sure whether or not anybody studies him. I'm not sure whether or not there's, for instance, a really nice annotated one-volume collection of his poetry that maybe you could get. He has a lot more famous poems than the one that I just read. I'll have to look into that and see. But he is represented with a few poems in this edition, in the revised and updated, 40 years later, the revised and updated edition of the Oxford Book of English Verse, which will now go into our repertory. We now have a handful, probably 5 poetry anthologies, and we will just bounce around between them. There's only one poetry anthology that I don't have that I wish I did have. It was from, probably 50 years ago. Some of you will know it. It's called The Voice That Is Great Within Us. And I struggled with that poetry anthology. I fought with it. There was a lot in there that I wanted to say, well, you're calling it this. That means there should be great stuff in here. And I went through years with that anthology, just grappling with my little white mass market paperback, where I just kept angrily saying there's nothing great in here at all. And I don't know that I would think that now. The next time I find that little white anthology, I will certainly get it and add it to our repertoire. But in the meantime, I don't think I'll stick with the old Oxford English Book of English Verse next time. I think we'll move far afield. We'll go somewhere else. But I don't know. We'll see how the whim takes me. So I will wrap this up for now, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.